The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of spirits lost to time. Snow whipped across the landscape, blurring the once familiar path that led through the dense forest. For most, the sight of a raging snowstorm would be a warning. For others, it was a signal to seek shelter, to huddle indoors with warmth and comfort. But for Ben and Claire, it was too late for that. They had rented a cabin for a quiet getaway, a retreat from the chaos of the city, with plans to escape the modern world for a few days of peace and serenity. The kind of isolation they thought would bring them closer together. What they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that the storm was only the beginning of a nightmare they would never escape. It was late afternoon when the storm began, the kind of storm that blankets the world in pure, suffocating white. The trees, already heavy with snow, began to bend under the weight, their branches groaning in protest as the winds picked up. It was a sound unlike any they'd ever heard before, something deep and guttural, like the earth itself was about to tear open. But they'd heard the forecast, a typical winter storm. No need to worry. The cabin, perched on the edge of a dark forest, was quaint, charming even. The walls creaked in the cold, and the fireplace crackled, sending shadows dancing across the wooden floors. Claire and Ben sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and enjoying the warmth. Outside, the storm intensified. By nightfall, visibility had dropped to nearly nothing. The wind pressed against the windows, howling and screeching, as if trying to force its way in. The peaceful retreat was slowly being consumed by the ferocity of the storm. But something fell off. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something else. A presence, an unsettling feeling that they weren't alone. Ben had been the first to notice it. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but as the hours passed, the feeling grew more distinct. There were noises outside, soft thumps, scratches, low, guttural growls. Claire hadn't heard anything, and Ben didn't want to alarm her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the storm. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the storm. There was something else, something wrong. He decided to check the locks on the door one last time before going to bed. But as he turned the knob, a strange, cold draft swept over him. The door was locked. Yet, as he stepped away, the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the snow reached his ears. It was too much. There was no one else out there. No one could survive in this storm. The sound of footsteps continued, drawing closer. Panic crept up Ben's spine like icy fingers. Claire, he whispered, but she was already asleep, her breathing slow and even, oblivious to the growing sense of dread creeping through the cabin. Ben stepped cautiously toward the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to peer outside. The swirling snow obscured his view, but through the haze, he could make out a figure, a shadow, a shape moving across the snow, creeping closer to the cabin. His heart slammed in his chest. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, as if it could see him even through the thick curtains. A sudden, violent knock on the door shattered the silence. The loud, jarring sound echoed through the cabin, sending a jolt of terror through Ben's body. He rushed to the door, his mind racing. Who could it be? What could they possibly want in the middle of this storm? Ben? Claire's voice floated out from the dark hallway, groggy with sleep. What's going on? Ben hesitated. The knock came again, more urgent this time. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. He needed to know. He needed to understand. But when he opened the door, there was no one there. The snow, falling in heavy sheets, had swallowed the footprints. The only thing left was an eerie silence, the kind of silence that fills you with dread. No wind, no storm, just stillness. Ben stepped outside, his boots crunching against the snow. Claire called out to him from the doorway, but he couldn't bring himself to turn around. His mind was consumed with the thought of the figure he had seen, the shadow. As he walked further into the storm, the cold bit at his skin, but it wasn't the chill of winter he feared. It was the knowledge that something was out there, watching him, waiting. Something unnatural. Something he couldn't explain, Suddenly, the wind picked up again, roaring to life, and the temperature dropped so quickly it was as if the air itself had turned to ice. Ben stumbled, unable to catch his breath, feeling the weight of something pressing against his chest. From the corner of his eye, a figure appeared in the distance. It was no longer a shadow but a solid form, a tall, hunched figure, cloaked in dark, tattered clothing. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Ben froze, paralyzed by a sense of foreboding. The figure's eyes glowed an unnatural shade of red, burning through the swirling snow, locking onto his own. "Ben, come back!" Claire screamed from the cabin, her voice desperate. The figure took a step closer. Ben could hear the crunch of snow under its feet, each step sending a wave of panic through his body. Without thinking, he turned and ran back toward the cabin, the figure trailing behind, its footsteps growing louder, closer. He reached the door, slamming it shut behind him. Claire was standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. What is it? Who was that?" Ben tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't explain. There was no way she would believe him. No way anyone would believe what he had just seen. But the storm had already begun to intensify again, the winds battering against the cabin with renewed ferocity. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as if something dark was lurking just beyond the light. Suddenly, there was a sound, a whisper, soft at first, like a voice carried by the wind. Then louder, clearer. "You shouldn't have come here." Ben spun around, his heart racing. The voice came from inside the cabin. Claire stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "Ben, did you hear that?" Before Ben could answer, the temperature inside the cabin dropped, a rush of cold air flooding the room. The fire sputtered, and the shadows deepened. The figure outside, the one he had seen in the storm, was now standing in the window, staring inside. And it wasn't alone. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted so suddenly that Claire's breath turned to mist in the air. Her wide, terrified eyes met Ben's as they both instinctively took a step backward, toward the dim glow of the dying fire. The sound of the wind outside had become deafening, as though it were a living thing, clawing at the walls, trying to force its way inside. Ben's pulse raced as he glanced at the window again. The figure, that figure, was still there, its face obscured in shadows, but its eyes, the eyes burned bright red, like embers from a fire. They pierced through the blinding snowstorm, directly at him. It was a gaze that seemed to see straight into his soul, colder than the storm outside, colder than the very air in the room. Claire was still staring at the window, her lips trembling. "Ben, do you see it? Is it human?" Ben couldn't answer. He wasn't sure, but he knew that whatever it wasn't something that belonged to this world. It wasn't a person. The shape, tall, hunched, and covered in ragged, dark clothing, seemed to float rather than walk, its movements unnervingly slow, deliberate, as if it were an ancient thing, something that had been waiting for this moment. The wind howled again, and the figure outside took a slow step toward the door. Ben's breath hitched in his throat. "It knows we're here." Suddenly, a loud thud sounded from the other side of the cabin. Claire jumped, clutching onto Ben's arm. "Did you hear that? It came from inside." Ben froze. It wasn't possible. They were alone in the cabin. The wind outside, the snowstorm, it was all that should be out there. But that noise? It had come from the other side of the house, near the back wall. Before he could speak, the door creaked. A cold draft surged through the room, and a dark shape appeared in the corner of his eye, not from the window, but from within the cabin. Ben turned slowly, fear crawling up his spine. The fire had died down to nothing but glowing embers, and the shadows stretched across the walls like dark fingers, reaching, twisting. The air was suffocatingly cold, and the low hum of something dark, something ancient, echoed in the distance, as though the house itself were whispering. Claire stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ben, I don't want to be here anymore. We need to leave. We need to get out of this place. Ben's heart sank. The thought of leaving crossed his mind too, but there was no way out now. The storm had trapped them, and whatever that thing was, it was between them and the door. Claire, I don't think we can leave. Ben's voice faltered as the shadows on the far side of the room seemed to twist and churn. Something was moving. Something was watching. Before Claire could respond, the whispers grew louder. Not a single voice, but a chorus of voices, low and growling, overlapping in an unintelligible chant. They filled the cabin, coming from every corner, from the walls themselves. Then the floor creaked, a slow, agonizing sound that rumbled through the wood, and the walls shuddered with the intensity of the wind outside. Claire screamed, stumbling back, but Ben couldn't move. His feet felt frozen to the floor. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, to get out, but it was like the house had a grip on him, pulling him deeper into its nightmare. A shape emerged from the shadows, not from the window, not from the door, from the wall itself. It was translucent at first, a vaporous figure that solidified as it moved closer, a tall, ghostly entity, clothed in tattered robes that flowed around it like mist. Its face was a blur, an unfinished mask, but its eyes, those glowing, burning red eyes, seemed to look right at him. Ben felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill his chest, like a weight pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to run, but the figure seemed to draw closer with every breath he took. Ben, Claire's voice was shaking, barely audible. She stepped backward toward the door, but the figure continued to advance, its movements slow and deliberate. The air was thick, almost suffocating. A sudden, icy gust of wind slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the windows. The lights flickered, dim, bright, then dim again, before plunging the cabin into darkness. Ben could hear Claire's panicked breaths in the pitch-black room, but he couldn't speak. His mouth was dry. The figure was standing directly in front of him now, its chilling presence filling the room. "Who are you?" Claire shouted into the darkness, her voice tinged with fear and defiance. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind screaming outside. Ben could feel the cold, a bone-deep chill that seeped into his very soul. "Claire," he whispered, barely able to form the words. "We need to get out of here now." But when he turned toward the door, it was no longer there. It was as though the very walls of the cabin had shifted, trapping them in a room that seemed to stretch on forever. The figure reached out a hand. No, not a hand, but a mass of shadowy tendrils that writhed and curled like snakes. The blackness around it thickened as it drew nearer, and the air grew colder, until it felt like they were standing in the heart of a frozen tomb. Claire screamed again, but the sound was drowned out by the storm outside, which seemed to rage louder and louder, as if the very heavens were joining in this nightmare. Ben could hear the whispers clearer now. They weren't just a jumble of voices anymore. They were words, real words. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have disturbed us. Now you'll join us." The walls of the cabin groaned, and the floor beneath them seemed to shift. Ben could feel the room spinning, the shadows swallowing everything around them. The last thing he remembered was the figure's eyes, those glowing red eyes. And then everything went black. In the silence that followed, the wind outside howled, and the storm continued to rage. But for Ben and Claire, the nightmare had only just begun. Ben awoke to the sound of the wind, raging, ferocious, like a beast outside the door. But there was no warmth from the fire, no comforting crackle of flames. The cabin was cold, deathly cold. His eyes fluttered open, but the room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that presses in from every side, suffocating all hope. His head throbbed with a dull ache, his body aching, as though he'd been lying on the cold ground for hours. A sharp, metallic taste coated his mouth, and his fingers felt stiff, frozen. As he tried to sit up, the world spun, and he realized he was lying on the floor, not the couch where he had been before. Panic shot through him. "Claire! Claire!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. There was no answer, not even an echo of her name. Ben scrambled to his feet, his legs weak beneath him, and his eyes strained to adjust to the darkness. The shadows were thick, clinging to the corners of the room like a living thing. His breath came in shallow gasps as he fumbled around, reaching for anything, his phone, the flashlight they brought with them, anything that could pierce the suffocating blackness. And then he heard it, a whisper, not from Claire. No! This voice was far colder, far older. It was the same guttural growl, the one that had filled the room before everything had gone black. The whispers twisted through his mind like icy tendrils, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. You can't escape. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice had come from all around him. Inside his mind it seemed as though it were not just a voice but a presence. Ben stumbled toward the walls, feeling his way through the room. His fingers brushed against something damp, cold to the touch. It was the wall, but it wasn't just the wall anymore. There were marks, scratches, scrawled symbols that seemed to writhe in the dark, like something alive. His hand hovered over them, instinctively pulling back, a feeling of revulsion crawling up his spine. The whispers were growing louder, echoing off the walls, louder than the wind outside. You shouldn't have come. Ben stumbled backward, his foot catching on something. He fell hard to the floor, his body crashing against the cold wood. His pulse quickened. Was that blood on the floor? His breath caught in his throat. The dim moonlight filtering through the small cabin window illuminated something just beyond his reach. A shape, a shadow that hadn't been there before. It was Claire, but she wasn't moving. Ben's heart dropped into his stomach as he crawled forward, desperate to reach her. He felt like he was in a nightmare. His hands grasped at her arm, but it was stiff, lifeless. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, her eyes wide open but unseeing. It was as if she'd been frozen in time, frozen in place by some unearthly force. No, no, Claire, Ben gasped, shaking her. His mind couldn't process what was happening, but the cold, horrifying truth was undeniable. Whatever that thing had been, whatever had crawled into the cabin with them, it had taken her. It had taken her, and he was next. He pulled her body closer, tears blurring his vision. I'll get us out of here. I swear I'll. But then something stopped him, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper. It was coming from behind him. Ben's head snapped around. The shadows seemed to move. The air thickened. And then he saw it, the figure. The same tall, hunched figure with burning red eyes, standing in the doorway. But this time, there was no mistaking its presence. It was no longer an abstract fear, no longer a shadow. It was real. Its shape flickered in and out of existence, like a broken reflection in the glass, as if it couldn't fully manifest. But its eyes, those glowing eyes, they were fixed on him. The whispers swelled to a deafening crescendo, filling the room with a terrible, awful sound that cut through Ben's mind like shards of glass. You disturb the dead. The figure took a step forward, and with it came a heavy, suffocating pressure, as though the room itself were collapsing inward. Ben felt the air grow colder still, biting into his skin. The figure's red eyes burned brighter, its form now clearer, sharper. There were no features, just an outline, an empty void within its shape. You've awakened what should not be. Ben tried to move, tried to run, but his body was frozen. His legs refused to work. His breath caught in his throat, a scream building but unable to escape. The figure's presence was overwhelming. His entire world, his reality, had shrunk to the terror of this moment. This thing, this creature, that was slowly closing in on him. The whispers wrapped around him, filling his ears. He could almost feel the words enter his mind, dark and ancient. You will join us. You will stay. Ben opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. His chest felt tight, suffocating under the weight of the thing before him. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure froze. The cabin was eerily silent. the air thick with tension, and then a shift. From the corner of his eye, Ben saw it, the marks on the walls. They were moving, twisting. The symbols were changing. They weren't static. They were shifting and growing, swirling into something new, something darker. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with malevolent energy. The very cabin had become part of the nightmare. We are many, and that's when Ben understood. The thing in front of him wasn't alone. The figure was just a sentinel, a keeper of the dead. This cabin, this land, it was cursed. There had been others who had ventured here, just like him, only to be consumed by the evil that had waited for centuries. This was a place of burial, a place where souls were trapped, where the dead never truly left. Ben's mind raced. I need to escape. I need to leave. But the door, he had tried to leave, and it had disappeared. There was no escape. A voice, low and guttural, whispered directly into his ear. The storm is our ally. You cannot run. And that's when the storm outside began to grow, the wind howling louder and louder, as if it too were a living thing, a force of nature that had joined the ancient entity that haunted the cabin. The storm was the spirit ally. It had been waiting for them to arrive, and now it was trapping them here. Ben's pulse thundered in his ears. He needed to act. He had to do something, but his thoughts were clouded by panic. The darkness swirled, and the figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. Then, in a desperate burst of adrenaline, Ben lunged toward the door, only to find it gone again. The walls creaked as though they were alive, shifting, closing in on him. Ben spun back around, his back pressed against the wall. He had nowhere to go, no way out. The whispers filled the room again, louder now, overlapping, more frantic. Join us. Forever. And then, with a sudden, violent lurch, the world around him shifted. Ben could feel his sanity unraveling before his very eyes. The whispers were everywhere now, flooding his mind, taking shape in every corner of the room. He could no longer tell where the voices were coming from, outside, inside, or from within his own mind. The walls themselves were alive, pulsating with a dark energy, a rhythm he couldn't escape. His fingers shook as they clutched the edge of the wall, as though trying to hold on to something, anything, that could ground him. But nothing could anchor him now. His world had become a twisted nightmare of shadow and cold, and there was no way out. The figure had vanished. Or perhaps it had never been there to begin with. Ben wasn't sure anymore. The shadows danced, shifting in unnatural ways, stretching toward him like grasping hands. The fire, what was left of it, sputtered weakly in the hearth, casting a sickly glow that seemed to accentuate the shadows in every corner. The cabin had become a mausoleum, a suffocating tomb that locked him inside. He closed his eyes, his breath ragged, desperate for some kind of relief. But the moment he did, the whispers returned, louder now, closer, and colder than before. They clawed at the edges of his consciousness, each word like a blade slicing through his thoughts. You shouldn't have come. You are one of us now. Ben opened his eyes and tried to focus. He had to think. He had to survive. But the truth was starting to seep through the cracks of his mind. There was no surviving this. He couldn't escape, and Claire was gone. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The cabin wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The storm outside was not a mere weather pattern. It was part of something ancient, something much darker than any storm he had ever known. It was a storm of the dead, an endless blizzard of souls that never found peace. Ben turned, eyes darting frantically across the room, searching for something, anything, that might offer an escape. But the door, the window, the walls, they were all sealed tight. The storm howled outside, a cruel reminder that no one had ever escaped this cursed place. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, a sudden, sickening cracking sound echoed through the cabin. Ben's head snapped toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls, they were moving. The very wood of the cabin began to shift, creaking and groaning as though the house itself were coming alive, shifting its bones to trap him in an unbreakable cage. The floor trembled beneath his feet as the air grew impossibly colder. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Ben's breath turned to ice in front of him, the frost forming on his skin like a shroud of death. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable. It was unnatural. It was as if the very marrow in his bones had frozen solid. He staggered backward, his hands shaking as he desperately sought for something to hold on to. He needed a weapon, something to fight with, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. "You can't fight us. You are already lost." And then he saw it. The shadows in the far corner of the room seemed to coalesce, pulling together into a dark, shifting shape. Ben's heart skipped a beat as the form solidified, like something alive, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. It was the figure from before, but now it was different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was fully formed, its shape tall and hunched, its cloak flowing around it like an inky black mist. It stepped forward, its feet leaving no trace on the floor, just darkness, an emptiness that spread with each movement. The whispers were deafening now, an unholy chorus of voices echoing in his ears, each one chilling him to the bone. "You should not have come here. We will take you." Ben's legs buckled beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, his mind spinning. His breathing quickened, panic rising in his chest like a tidal wave. The figure drew closer, its eyes burning with a terrifying, predatory hunger. With every step it took, the room grew colder. The wind outside howled, a constant, unyielding scream that seemed to mock his hopelessness. Ben's mind flashed to Claire, her lifeless body still lying cold on the floor. She had been the first to succumb to whatever this thing was, but he wasn't going to follow her that easily. No, he couldn't. His eyes fell on the fireplace, where the last remnants of the fire flickered weakly. The cabin was so cold now that the flames had no strength to push back the darkness. But if he could just... He lurched toward the hearth, scrambling across the cold floor, his hands brushing over the shards of wood, the coal, the remains of what had once been warmth. His hands closed around a jagged piece of wood, a charred, broken log that had once been part of the fire. It was his only weapon. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the figure. The shadows stretched toward him like fingers, the red eyes now glowing brighter, more intense. It was almost as if the figure were feeding on his fear. He gripped the piece of wood tight, his knuckles white with effort. His breath was ragged, the cold air searing his lungs. He could feel the weight of the darkness closing in around him, but he refused to give in. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but determined. "I'm not going to let you take me." The figure paused, its hollow gaze fixed on him. The wind outside picked up, battering the cabin as if the storm itself had joined in the hunt. But the figure didn't flinch. It didn't move. Then it spoke. "You are too late." Ben's blood ran cold. He had no time to react as the shadows lunged forward, an explosion of dark tendrils reaching out toward him. The cold burned his skin like ice, searing him with an intensity that felt like it was ripping him apart from the inside out. With a scream, Ben swung the piece of wood, slamming it into the nearest shadow. The moment the wood made contact, a blast of cold air exploded from the impact, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. But the victory was short-lived. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form reassembling with unnatural speed. "You cannot win." The shadows closed in again, and Ben felt his strength fading, his body weakening. The wood slipped from his grasp, and the cold took over once more, creeping into every part of him, freezing his bones, his soul. In his final moments, Ben understood the terrible truth. This wasn't just a storm. This wasn't just a haunted cabin. It was a trap for the living, meant to draw them in, to consume them, to trap their souls forever. As the darkness closed in, Ben's mind fractured, and the last thing he heard was the storm, the whispering, haunting storm, screaming his name. Ben's vision blurred as the icy tendrils of the dark figure continued to close in, wrapping around him like a shroud. His body was no longer his own. It felt numb, a hollow shell that couldn't move. His breath came in short, painful gasps, each inhalation like swallowing shards of glass. He was frozen, not just by the unnatural cold, but by the paralyzing realization that he was being consumed, mind, body, and soul, by the malevolent force that had ensnared them all. The last of the warmth left his chest, and the shadows tightened their grip. The whispers rose to a maddening crescendo, swirling through his thoughts like an infernal symphony. They were no longer just words. They were feelings, sensations, images. The storm outside howled as though it had a life of its own, a malicious laugh that echoed through the cabin's walls. "You are one of us now," the voice hissed again, this time so close that Ben could feel the coldness of its breath against his ear. "The dead never leave. They lingered, they wait, and soon you will join them." The world around him twisted, and Ben's body trembled violently, as though something was trying to claw its way out from inside him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The cold had seeped into his lungs, stealing his ability to speak. His limbs were frozen solid, his heart slow and pounding in his chest, as if it too was beginning to ice over. And then in a single instant everything stopped. The storm outside fell silent, the howling wind cutting off abruptly, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The suffocating cold that had gripped the cabin suddenly lessened, the air thick with a weight that was almost expectant. The figure stood before him, towering over him, its red eyes gleaming with a terrible, ancient hunger. But this time it wasn't moving. It was waiting. "Come," it whispered, its voice now a strange melody of dead whispers and harsh winds. "Come and join us in the void. The storm is the gate, the storm is the keeper, and you are the last." Ben felt himself drawn toward it. He couldn't move, couldn't fight it anymore. It was as though the very fabric of his will had unraveled, thread by thread, until he was nothing but a puppet on strings. He could feel his legs lifting, his body moving toward the figure as if he were already dead. His chest felt hollow, empty, like the nothingness inside the figure was slowly filling him, swallowing what was left of his humanity. He tried to resist. He tried to hold on to the fleeting fragments of his own mind. Claire. He thought of Claire, her face, her warm touch. But it was slipping away, fading into the storm. Her memory, like everything else, was being consumed by the cold. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and Ben was drawn closer. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned with an unnatural rhythm, as though the very cabin itself were mourning what was about to happen. The last remnants of light flickered from the fire as the figure took a step forward, its outstretched hands casting long shadows over Ben's trembling form. But then, just as it seemed the darkness would engulf him completely, something shifted. A crackling sound, small at first, almost imperceptible, echoed from the fireplace. Ben's eyes darted toward it, his vision swimming with darkness. There, in the ashes, a faint light began to glow. It was weak, flickering, but it was a sign that all hope was not lost. His pulse quickened as he forced his frozen limbs to move. His hand reached out toward the embers, desperation burning in his chest. The figure saw this, and its voice lowered, mocking. "You think you can fight us? You think a fleeting flame can banish what has always been?" But Ben didn't care. He grabbed the burning ember, feeling the heat of it even as his fingers began to freeze. With one last burst of strength, he hurled it toward the figure. For a moment, the figure did not react. The ember flew through the air, glowing brighter as it neared the darkness. Then, just as it collided with the figure's chest, a deafening crack sounded through the cabin, and the world seemed to shatter. The ember exploded in a burst of white-hot light. The figure screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman, a scream that echoed deep within Ben's soul. The shadows shrieked and twisted, retreating from the light as if they were made of smoke. For a moment, there was nothing. No whispers, no shadows, no cold, and then silence. Ben collapsed to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. He gasped for air, every breath sharp and ragged, as though he had been underwater for far too long. The cold was still there, lingering at the edges of his mind, but it was no longer all-consuming. The storm outside was no longer howling, and the oppressive weight of the cabin seemed to lift. Ben looked around, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The walls were still marked with strange symbols, but they were no longer pulsating with energy. The darkness had receded. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone. But Claire, she was still gone too. Ben stumbled to his feet, his limbs trembling. The cabin felt emptier now, as though something vital had been sucked out of it. He walked toward the door, his mind still reeling from the horror he had witnessed. His hand reached for the doorknob, but when he touched it, the storm outside seemed to answer. The wind began to howl once more. It wasn't over. Ben's heart raced as he yanked open the door, only to be greeted by the blinding, white expanse of snow and ice. The storm was still there, fierce and relentless, as though it had been waiting for him to make the wrong move. The world beyond the door was a frozen wasteland. It was as if time had stopped entirely. But the storm wasn't the only thing out there. There, in the swirling snow, Ben saw something move, a shape, a figure. It was Claire, but it wasn't her. Her face was pale, frozen, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was surrounded by shadow, and in her hands was something, a dark, twisted object that seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy that had filled the cabin. The storm was feeding on her now, consuming her soul, just as it had consumed so many others before her. Ben's heart dropped into his stomach. "No," he whispered, but his voice was carried away by the wind, swallowed by the endless storm. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure of Claire disappeared back into the swirling blizzard. The door slammed shut behind Ben with an unnatural force, locking him inside the cabin once again. The whispers returned, faint but undeniable. "The storm will never let you go." Ben stumbled back into the heart of the cabin, his mind unraveling in real time. The whispers continued to claw at him. And as the storm raged outside, he knew now, that the storm was never truly over. It was just beginning.